Well, let's do it. I think these are live. Hey, how are you, Patrick? How nice to see you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Chris Monteith. Nice to see you.
Everyone's got great names on the
Oh, yeah, water. You're smart.
Pencils.
Push.
I'm struck. I think.
Yeah. Come on.
Is it on?
No, I don't think so. Shoot.
I mean, I'm loud.
I need it for.
Do you want me to be in the middle? Okay. Yeah, that's fine.
This one's working.
Okay. All right. Great. Thanks. And I'll just move up after the. Should I give?
The sun's right there. It's on.
Okay. Thanks. I'll just go. Okay. Thank you. Thanks. I'm gonna be up there. All right.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And press the button.
Yeah.
I'm really struggling with this mic.
Yeah.
Is it on?
I think so. Yeah.
All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Catherine DeWitt, and I lead the Broadband Research Initiative at the Pew Charitable Trusts. Thank you also to the Senate Broadband Caucus for hosting us, and we will get started with opening remarks from Senator King.
This is one of those frequent occasions where a senator is called upon to talk to an audience, each one of whom knows more about the topic than he or she does. But that's not going to hold me back. Just to lay the groundwork, and I'm sure everyone in this room realizes it, broadband is the essential infrastructure of the 21st century. And the problem and the reason Senator Capito and I are here and John Bozeman will be here later is rural America is this is a really serious problem for rural America for two reasons. One, without broadband, it's very difficult to develop any kind of economic activity. And secondly, it's very difficult to keep people living in an area that doesn't have broadband. If you can imagine yourself looking at a house with a realtor and they say, well, it has a nice view and it's on the road and everything, but by the way, you'll never have broadband, chances are you wouldn't buy that house. And yet this is the case in many parts of rural America. So that's the context in which this is so incredibly important to states like Maine, West Virginia, Arkansas. Most every state in the country has urban and rural areas. Well, maybe not Rhode Island, but pretty much everybody does. So that's why this is such an important issue. It's absolutely broadband and workforce are the two most serious economic issues in my state. Adequate workforce and the availability of broadband. Of course, there are lots of changes coming in technology, 5G, which may not help rural areas that much because 5G only operates in a density situation. What we're talking about today is mapping. And I'm a great believer that you can't make good policy without good data. And if we don't have good mapping of exactly where the service is, where it isn't, then it's very hard to really determine what the policy should be or where the policy initiatives should take place. For example, all the maps show Augusta, Maine as a place with great cellular service, but as a guy who drives through it periodically, I can tell you if you're on the Maine Turnpike just west of Augusta, forget it. You don't have cellular service, let alone broadband. And so I have two issues I want to raise. I'm sure will be discussed. One is, my understanding is that that Form 477 process says an entire census block is served if there's one node of service. And in rural America, census blocks are really big. A census block in an urban area can be 1 square block. We've got census blocks in Maine that are 14 square miles. And so if you have one little corner of it that's served and that checked the box for that census block in the mapping, then that's really not representative of what the situation is. The other piece is that apparently the form asks not whether there's service now, but whether a provider could bring service to the area in the near future. That's not satisfactory because we don't know whether that will ever happen. So I'm anxious to listen and learn something this morning about this process, but I can't emphasize enough, A, the importance of this whole subject matter to the country, and particularly the rural areas of the country, and secondly, the importance of having good data and good maps so that we know what the impact of our policies are going to be, and I look forward to hearing our panel. And I'm now honored to introduce my colleague from Arkansas, Senator John Boozman, who's been involved in this initiative since we began. Great to have you with us, John. Please join us.
The co-chairs are not only bound at the hip through this subject in the sense that our states are in a situation, well, the country's in a situation where we desperately need to get these things sorted out, but we're also very good friends. You hear a lot about all the acrimony that goes on and this and that, but again, lots of friendships, lots of people working on a variety of issues, and this is one that really draws a lot of strange bedfellows as far as conservative Republicans, liberal Democrats, and the whole gamut in between, and independents. I'm sorry. Thank you for correcting me. But I just want to echo what Angus said. You know, this is such an important subject. Really, if we don't get this right, you can't get anything else right. We need accurate information. We need to make sure that the areas that are said to be served are actually being served. And then, two, if you don't have accurate information, you can't plan, the powers that be can't plan so that you don't have duplication in the future. And so for lots of different reasons, this really is. In fact, when I was serving in the House, I had the opportunity to sit by Tom Osborne. Shelley served with him, and he became a very, very good friend. People would ask him about winning. And he'd say, well, you know, I didn't talk about winning. I talked about doing the little things. You do the little things, you do the basic things, and then everything falls in. And I would argue that this is one of the simply most important little basic things that we have to get right. And I know I and the rest of the caucus are committed to helping in any way. Thank you, panel, for being here. We've got a great panel that's going to discuss and solve our problem. So I'm excited. Shelley is from West Virginia, and again, all of our states have a lot in common. And I had the honor of serving with Shelley in the House, and again, is a very, very good friend. Nobody works any harder for rural America, and so we really do appreciate you very, very much, Shelley.
Thank you, John and Angus. And John neglected to mention that we sat next to each other at every committee in the House, and we're still sitting next to each other, so that helps us. But our colleagues have worked together. We've had several meetings on different aspects, and I would gather that some of you have been here for the previous ones, whether it's impacts on education, deployment of resources for broadband, all the different issues that come in front of this. I would like to thank my staff, in particular Victoria, who is on her way to have a baby pretty soon. So we will miss her here at the Broadband Caucus, but she's going to be having her own caucus in her own head, I think. But today, I don't know if you all were at the last Commerce hearing when we talked about mapping, but I was at the end of the questioning, which I always am, because that is such a large committee, and I'm all the way at the end of the dais of the Republican side. And I think my opening statement was, haven't we had this meeting before? I feel like we've talked so much. I see Mr. Kimcoff is like, yes, we've had this discussion before. And we can all agree that it's the mapping, the accurate mapping is completely essential to delivering not just the dollars, but the service, yes, but the dollars, to make sure that, as John said, that they're not repetitive. As Angus said, I can drive through my state and tell you when we're going to have drop service, where we're going to have no service, and it doesn't. It's a lot of times it's not accurately reflected in what we hear from providers and also what we see on the maps. So it's a source of great concerns for all of us. We're all stakeholders in this. If those of us who are left behind in the digital divide aren't able to close that divide, we're going to drag the rest of our states and our regions down with us, and we don't want to see that. We want to see a lot of equity between urban and rural, and getting good accuracy on our maps is something that's exceedingly important. We've introduced legislation to allow folks to voluntarily provide valuable feedback about the actual mobile service in their communities. It's kind of a hard test, but you can do it. I've also been working with Senator Schatz from Hawaii, and we are on the cusp of introducing some new legislation that will help to lead to more granular mapping, especially in rural America, and we're excited about getting conclusion on that and working together. So we have a great group of panelists, very knowledgeable and accomplished, and they will address the challenges and hopefully present some of the solutions to us. And listen, I think by the fact that we have this many people in the room at a noon meeting on a Tuesday afternoon, I think is emblematic of how important this is to a whole variety of people on Capitol Hill, and I thank you all for your time and attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Again, my name is Catherine DeWitt, and I lead the Broadband Research Initiative at the Pew Charitable Trusts. The Trust's mission is to bring research and tools to help policymakers navigate complex policy issues. And I think, as all of the senators just outlined, and as we all know, broadband data and connectivity mapping are certainly one of those issues, which is why I was so excited to be invited to moderate this panel today. Our research to date shows us that this isn't just about better data, it's about the right data and the public and private partnerships it will take to get there. So with that in mind, let's kick it off. Doug, we'll start with you. If everyone could introduce themselves and the organizations that they represent.
Hi, good morning, afternoon, I guess. Wearing my newest hat, I'm the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for NTIA, which is the principal advisor to the President on telecommunications and information matters. Wearing my previous hat, I'm Associate Administrator for the Office of Telecommunications and Information Applications, which in that role, my team basically working on deploying broadband infrastructure programs with states and communities around the country and digital inclusion programs through our Broadband USA program. Also have responsibility for our role in the American Broadband Initiative, which is the administration's initiative to look at ways to improve broadband deployment in rural America through really three buckets: streamlined federal permitting, leveraging federal assets, and three, improving the efficiency of federal funding. Also, we lead up the State Broadband Leaders Network, which is a consortium of 45 states and territories which regularly meet to discuss federal and state best practices on broadband deployment. And then, of course, the newest initiative being the Mapping Initiative, which I'm here to talk about today. Jeff, James?
Yeah.
Let's go with this. All right. Hello.
There we go.
Hi, I'm James Assey. I'm the Executive Vice President at NCTA, the Internet and Television Association. We represent the largest broadband companies in America, providing service to 95% of households. And we focus a lot of time not only on building high-speed networks, but we also focus a lot on the adoption challenges. Many of our companies have low-cost broadband programs that really try to work the problem from both ends, ensuring that people have access to robust gigabit capability. We're currently in the process of charting a course to 10 gigabits and beyond with respect to our next generation infrastructure, but we recognize that You can build the infrastructure, but you still have to make sure that folks are actually using it and integrating it into their daily lives. So we spend a lot of time thinking about how best to do that, and we really appreciate the attention of the Senate Broadband Caucus to focus on these issues in particular.
Good afternoon. My name is Chris Monteith, and I am Chief of the Wireline Competition Bureau at the Federal Communications Commission. The Wireline Competition Bureau, WCB, is the organizational unit within the FCC that has principal responsibility for the Universal Service Fund. And as part of our role in overseeing the Universal Service Fund, we also have been the organizational unit that has been responsible for what we call the Form 477, the principal vehicle by which the Commission collects data on broadband deployment and broadband subscription. I am happy that I am going to be sharing that role with the newly established Office of Economics and Analytics. And I think it's been very clear under Chairman Pai's leadership that closing the digital divide is our top priority. Getting good, accurate information about where broadband has been deployed is critical to achieving that goal. So I look forward to a robust discussion to answer some of the questions that have already been posed here. And I also want to thank the members of the Broadband Caucus for bringing us together. A dialogue and sharing of the lessons learned, sharing of our information and our experiences, I think also is critical to success here. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Patrick Halley with U.S. Telecom, the Broadband Association. I also want to thank the Rural Broadband Caucus for hosting this event. It's an extremely important topic. It's one of the top priorities for our association is to get this issue solved. I'm also pleased to be joined by our colleagues from NTIA and the FCC. There's no doubt that solving this challenge is going to require collaboration between industry and government, including Congress and federal agencies and state agencies for that matter. So it's important that we're all here together talking about this. U.S. Telecom is an association that represents the nation's broadband providers, from some of the largest companies in the world to small rural broadband companies serving rural communities in states all across this country. We've been doing it for a long time. These companies have been serving rural America for 100 years at this point, making sure that every American has access to originally telephone service and now robust broadband service. Our members have deep experience in deploying broadband to some of the hardest to reach, most high-cost rural areas in this country. And they've had deep experience participating with the FCC's universal service programs. And a key element of ensuring that we do get everybody connected, and one of the reasons we're here to talk today, is making sure that we know not just where broadband is today, but also where it is not. And to do that, we have to really look at sort of two separate issues. First is, where are all of the locations in this country that need broadband, from homes to businesses to farms, for that matter? And exactly where are they? Because if we don't know where they are, then we don't know how to serve them. So we're extremely focused on getting the most granular information about the exact location of all broadband serviceable locations, so that once we know that, we as an industry can then report to the FCC, to NTIA, to others about which locations do or don't have broadband service. And then we can effectively target federal resources to make sure we're getting to those truly unserved, every single one of them, and that we're not overbuilding locations that already have broadband. And that's what this is all about, and I look forward to the discussion. We just launched a pilot in April in Virginia and Missouri to really get down to figuring out how we can do this best to truly solve the problem.
Great, thanks everyone. Okay, forewarning for the group, we have a little bit of a rapid fire question situation today. We have a lot of content to get through, so we'll get started. Patrick, you just touched on this a little bit, but I'd like to ask each of you, why do data and mapping matter?
Well, the reason it matters is because what each of the senators mentioned, broadband is the indispensable infrastructure of the 21st century. You will not have economic development. You will not have modern education capabilities. You will not have modern telehealth opportunities. Communities will not thrive without access to broadband. Literally everything we do depends on it. When I was at the commission, I had an opportunity to visit Alaska with the chairman at the time. And I'm talking about remote areas, right? Took a plane to get to a place, to get on a smaller plane, to get to a place where you could only get to by plane. And these folks were doing telehealth using the federal universal service dollars so that folks who are, literally in the middle of nowhere could get access to the best dentist and the best doctor in Anchorage or really anywhere in the country only because of that broadband connection. And Alaska is, of course, an extreme example, but there are many areas all over the states that you all represent. I grew up in very rural upstate New York, where I'm sure you didn't have broadband at the time. But with that connectivity comes opportunity. And so, that's why we're all here. And to really effectively target everybody so that they can all share in that opportunity, we have to figure out where these folks are and make sure that those who don't have broadband get it as soon as possible.
Go ahead, Chris.
And I would just echo Patrick's words. Broadband is at the core of what the FCC is doing. It's a part of our core mission, our universal service mission. And in order for us to perform that mission and fulfill that mission, we need to have accurate broadband data. It's really, truly interesting as I work at the Commission to see just how much the data collection is used all throughout the agency, not just in the Wireline Competition Bureau, but all of our sister bureaus and offices within the agency rely on this data. We rely on it for our policy making. We rely on it for any number of reports. The Wireline Competition Bureau just recently put out a veterans broadband report, a tribal broadband report. We have our monitoring reports. It just helps inform increasingly everything that we do at the Commission. So it is exceedingly important that we have good data. Could not agree more that we have to have the most granular level of data that we can, the most accurate data. But I also would note that is challenging. With 150 million or so addresses nationwide, it is a daunting, challenging task to get to the level of granularity that there's, I think, a common understanding that we want to get to. And it's only, I believe, through working together that we're going to get there.
Thank you. James?
I guess I would just agree with what was said before. I mean, the only maybe additional wrinkle I might put on it is I think we can all stipulate that broadband is going to be the platform by which all of us participate in the 21st century, no matter where we live, whether that's here in town or in rural parts of America. And the map, while we focus on the map a lot, we should, I think, maybe step back and recognize that really the map is just a tool to help us figure out where we don't have broadband. And for that reason, I think it's important that the strategies we use to try and shape and make the map as accurate as we can really reflect the goals that we're trying to achieve here. In this country, we have a long history and a strong ethic of wanting to promote universal access to communications networks. You can go back to the 30s and Theodore Vail and universal service. And when we think about what it's going to take to provide broadband, particularly in rural America, there are no question there are challenges. There are challenges of demography, there are challenges of geography, and there are challenges of technology. So it's really important for us to understand where broadband isn't so that the resources we can bring to bear, not only from the private sector in maximizing the investment that private companies are making, but also the investment that the government fills in and uses to help fill in the gaps is used most efficiently, and we ensure that we have the greatest amount of accountability in the program that we have. And for that reason, one of the things that NCTA is focused on is trying to figure out a way to get a more granular look at the census block availability data and to really go beneath the census block to a sub-census block level in getting the FCC to focus on the submission of polygon shape files, which, as I explained to my 5-year-old daughter, is essentially kind of like tracing around your hand to make a turkey, in the sense that you are tracing where the network is, where it's capable of providing service, and that we get a clearer picture of within a census block the parts that are served actually or that could be served within the regular course of business, and then the parts where we need to focus our resources on to make sure that service is available. We definitely want to work with NTIA, the FCC, and really all the partners who really share a common goal, I think, of adopting policies that are going to make sure that we use our money wisely and that we reach our common goal of making sure that broadband is available.
Well, I agree with everything my counterparts have said here. I think that we all agree that it's the economic engine for rural America, right? The growth, whether you're farmers, agriculture, et cetera, you need access to broadband. And, if we lose sight of what that means, if they don't have that in the future, if they fail to have a scalable network, and when we talk about speeds, it's not just unserved, do they have adequate services, is to ensure that, rural America remains. I mean, you're having an outpouring of populations as it is. Youth aren't coming back after they graduate from college or other, schooling, that it's important that they have something to come back to, that they can have home businesses, that they can stay on the farm and grow that. So I think the need for where it is not is critical, but also at what level and what is scalable. It's not just about 25.3 or 10.1. They have to be able to grow as we move forward into the future.
Okay. So would each of you be able to detail what you view as the strengths and deficiencies of the current mapping effort, how you're trying to address those, and what those efforts will do to help policymakers? Doug, let's start with you.
Okay. Well, I think we all agree granularity is an issue, especially in rural America with the size of census blocks, et cetera. Senator King accurately described that issue. I think we're all familiar with it. So with NTIA, we are looking at currently rolling out a pilot at the end of this fiscal year with the 8 states, and I'll just read those off because somebody will ask me. California, Utah, Minnesota, North Carolina, West Virginia, Massachusetts, Maine, and Tennessee. That's our initial 8. We are working with them. We have agreements with 7 of the 8, and the 8th is coming in hopefully this week, in which we are collecting data from those 8 states. I will tell you, uniformity does not exist on the collection of data in the states, which is an issue going forward. So you're trying to take 8 different types of data and apply them and uniformly measure broadband penetration. We're also looking at working with the associations, with carriers. We've probably had over 70 meetings so far with various entities, third party data sets, to do layering of the data so that you can see where, for now, when you use 477 as a base and you lay over these different layers, you'll start to see a trend of where broadband isn't in those areas that it's claimed to be today. And that'll give a more efficient target to that. We'd love to see address-based, land parcels been talked about, road segments. But I think if we could get to the address level would be granularity, that would be very beneficial.
James, before you jump in, Senator Klobuchar has joined us, so if you'd like to come and give a few remarks.
Thank you. Hi. I'm actually going to listen for a little bit and don't have much to add, except I want to thank everyone for coming and my colleagues. We all know how important this is, and we are seeing some progress around the country for more expansion. But one of the things that we've learned is it's going to be hard to make the case unless we have good mapping. And my state has actually been a leader in broadband mapping, and earlier this year we were chosen by NTIA to collaborate with 7 other states across the country to broaden and update the National Broadband Availability Map. But I think we all know more needs to be done. We need reliable data about where services exist and where they do not. As we all know, the FCC's maps overstate coverage in many rural areas. And this means that communities that really need help to deploy broadband are ineligible to receive federal funds. And I've heard this throughout the country. We've introduced this improving broadband map with Senator Capito as well as Manchin and Hoeven and others to help improve the FCC maps and provide better data. And it directs the FCC to consider using consumer-reported data as well as data from state and local governments. I guess we think maybe the consumers will notice if it's not really working for them. So I'm excited that we're taking on this topic because it's one that I've heard everywhere in rural areas, and that is that people claim they have coverage, but they don't really have coverage, or maybe they have coverage and it's very limited. And this will give us the opportunity to get the service to the people that need it. Thank you.
You want me to pick up on that, or okay? So I think the question was, what are we doing? Or?
What do you view as the strengths
Yeah.
and deficiencies, and what are you doing, and how will that help policymakers?
Sure. So strengths and deficiencies. I think it's worth remembering that there was a time when we collected data through the Form 477 process via zip code, and then we went to census tract and census block. So, notwithstanding the limitations of any map, I think we should recognize that there has been a lot of effort, and there are a lot of great ideas, I think, that people are working on, and certainly there are now new other sources of data that we can draw from to help us verify and see with a clearer picture where broadband is and where it isn't. We've really chosen, I think, to focus, on the Achilles heel that is most often talked about, at least with respect to the fixed line segment, and the fact that when you report on the basis of census blocks, if you serve one house in that census block, the entire census block looks as served. And what we've seen is, well, if we want to improve that process, and if we're looking forward to a world where over the next 10 years we're going to be providing $20 billion of universal service support in order to try and get broadband where it is most needed, what's really important is how can we improve the maps in the quickest amount of time to get the most benefit for the largest amount of households in the United States. So as I said earlier, what we've focused on is saying rather than have the reporting to be one household in a census block means that the entire census block is served, let's create a system where providers are able to submit on a sub-census block level the polygon shapefile of the areas that they are serving or could serve in the normal course of business if somebody called up and said, hey, I'd like to get broadband service from you. We take some comfort in the fact that we see some familiarity with shapefiles. There are states like Minnesota and Kansas that use it. We have some familiarity through the RUS process where grantees are having to submit shapefile data. So it is not like reading Greek. It is not an unfamiliar language. That is not to dismiss the complexity of changing to a shapefile-based data submission, but our hope is that that would be the quickest, surest, and most scalable way of getting a more accurate at least first picture of where broadband is not. And then backing up that, I think taking a page that I know a number of folks have supported, which is to use the power of crowdsourcing and to use the powers of consumers and people with boots on the ground in these local communities to help us refine these maps to the extent there are errors. There are issues as you get more and more granular. Certainly there are plenty of places in this country where you may not even have addresses in rural America. So we are all, I think, working on a common goal of trying to provide service where it's not, and there are a lot of great ideas out there. We believe that moving to shapefile-based submissions will get us the furthest amount of progress in the shortest amount of time. Well, I should let the commerce people talk about the census. Census questions are a bit...
It's not my area of expertise, Senator, of whether or not you could do that, but I can do that, absolutely. Happy to take that back.
Chris?
Yes, I want to thank James for just noting that our work on the Form 477 has been an evolving process. The 477 at this point in time is almost 20 years old. So we have moved towards increasingly more granular levels of collection there. And that said, we do recognize that we're at a point in time where we need to get yet more granular to make sure that we are putting forth the kind of data that will really help inform our processes. And I think, as I mentioned, as the organizational unit that oversees the Universal Service Fund, we are keenly aware that we do not want to spend a dollar in subsidizing where it's not needed. We take very seriously our obligations to be good overseers of the USF. The chairman in 2017 did open a rulemaking proceeding that was aimed at looking at how we can get to more granular levels of data collection, whether it be the road segment at the road segment level or the address level. And each of these options, as well as the others that are on the table, have both pros and cons to them. But what is common, and I see from the senators' questions, is that we need to have accurate data. We need to know where data is being overstated. We need to know that we're getting it right, and that is a process that will take some time. I look forward to working with all of my colleagues here and the other panelists to make sure we get it right. I think that's a common theme as well.
So I also want to give the FCC credit for the improvements that they've made over time to the Form 477 data collection process. It's better now than it ever has been. It's the best source of information we have in terms of a single national data set of broadband information. There are, of course, limitations for some of the reasons that my fellow panelists have pointed out. But in terms of a tool for understanding sort of general national level broadband trends, it is a useful tool, and it is useful for other policymaking areas that the FCC relies on that information. With respect to trying to get broadband to the unserved and to every American in this country, though, we can and must do better at getting more accurate, more granular, detailed location-by-location data. And the good news is we have the tools to do it now. So U.S. Telecom, along with our partners at WISPA and ITTA, formed a broadband mapping coalition in April and announced the fact that we have a particular proposal to get much more granular and much more accurate down to the individual location level, which we think can and must be done. There are a couple things that were said earlier. Catherine, you said we need not better data, the right data. I couldn't agree more. We can make incremental steps towards improving the broadband data that we have now in the desire to do things quickly, but we can also get much better than incremental improvements. I mean, this is not a time for incrementalism. This is not a time for doing half the job. This is a time for taking every single data source we have available to us and doing this right. And here's how we're doing it. This is our proposal in a nutshell. There's two separate issues. Number one, where are the locations? Before we report anything, right? Before we report, I serve this area or I serve that area, and the methodology of how we report it, you have to know where the locations are. And in that sense, you need to know where the broadband, where the homes, businesses, farms are today. Where are they physically located? Because we don't necessarily know that today, right? In urban and suburban areas, we have a better sense of where locations actually are. But even addresses, if you have an address, that can be a mile away from where the actual location is. And so we have to get a very deep understanding of where every location is in this country. And the way we do that is not to just rely on carriers reporting where they serve broadband today. It's to take every available data source that we have available to us now, data sources that we didn't have available in electronic formats even 2 years ago, but we do now. So we have digitized land parcel boundaries. We have land parcel attributes, building polygons. We have addresses. We have land attributes. We have geo-referenced location information on individual buildings from different sources. We have carrier information on where we do serve or have served in the past. There are a lot of different data sources that are available to understand where all the locations are in this country. And why is that important? Because if we're going to report, whether we use a polygon or whether we use a propagation map for a wireless internet service provider, or whether we literally report each individual location that we serve, there has to be context. Where are the locations underneath that shapefile, for example, right? If you're saying with a shapefile, to draw the turkey analogy that James used, and I serve all this area underneath my hand and I don't serve the rest, well, how many locations are underneath that shapefile? Where are they? And the areas that aren't served, right, that the shapefile doesn't cover, and we're saying, as a provider in that instance, these are areas that are not served by broadband today. Well, how many locations are out there? Where are they? How do we know which ones are served and which ones aren't served? So we really need to take this first step, and we can do it. This is not something we could have done 3 years ago. We have open source data sets, we have commercial data sets, we have carrier information, we have government information. So part of our pilot is in Missouri and Virginia is to basically say, because we think this is doable. We think this can be done relatively quickly. We think we can complete our pilot and have a complete understanding of every single location in those 2 states within a few months. Once we have that fundamental database of where all these locations are, then we ask ourselves, okay, which ones of those are served or not? And exactly where are they? Which we won't know if all we do is rely on carriers to submit information to say, I serve this area. The rest of the area is unserved, right? So it's important that this be a 2-step process. Where are the locations? And then on top of that, we go to the next phase, which is, okay, which ones of those are actually served today? And there's different ways we can do that. The shapefile approach that James talked about is definitely a reasonable approach to say, I serve under this shape, I serve all the locations, except under our approach, you'll actually know where those locations are before the shapefile process happens. Or in another way we can do that is to say, the carriers have submitted data, right? In our example, we would do this with the FCC as part of a reform to their Form 477 process, and they come back and say, here's the actual locations of each of these, broadband service locations. Which ones of these do you serve? And we'll tell you, we serve these. We have no problem. We already have to do this in the universal service context. Whenever we get funding from the FCC, we have to report a geo-referenced latitude and longitude of every location that we serve. So we've been doing this at an address level already in the universal service context. We're saying we should do this for every location. Consumers, have a right to be served. And the only way we're going to effectively do that is truly understanding at a granular level. The other thing that's important, I think Doug mentioned, he said uniformity does not exist. That's true. The way in which different states do things is different. The value of the FCC's program is it is a national data set that's done in the same manner. So if the FCC can take this much more granular information, and we believe they can do it, and we don't need to cut corners, and we don't need to go fast, we need to do it right, which actually can be done pretty quickly in our view. That's going to make a big difference. Here's another important reason. Not only is it important to know where these locations are so that we don't overbuild them and that we target money to those areas, they're about to spend $20 billion, the commission, on the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. It's fantastic. It's going to get a lot of people broadband that don't have it today. The way in which they're going to spend that money is through a reverse auction, which is companies come to the table and say, I will serve these locations, and I will, at least with our proposal, you will know exactly where those locations are. And I'll just give you one example. An address might say that the home is at this address. The reality is it might actually be 2 miles down a long driveway or a rural route. It's not actually at this location. So if I'm going to bid in an auction, I need to be able to bid intelligently to know how much money it's actually going to cost to serve these areas. Just knowing the address is not often enough. What you need to know is where is the actual latitude and longitude of that entity, of that location, so that I can bid effectively. And it will have a much more efficient and effective auction if we really have much more granular data. So our view is take all the data sources. Don't just take the carrier's word for where they serve today. Take the government sources, take the commercial data sources, put them together, figure out exactly where the locations are, then have carriers report where they serve, because that's going to be a lot better than just doing going halfway there.
Thank you. Each one of us has touched on the importance of collaboration. And Chris and Doug, I'd like to put this question directly to the both of you. How are NTIA and the FCC collaborating on improving data mapping at this point? And how are you working with the private sector?
So we've had numerous meetings with the FCC. been a very cooperative relationship. We are building, right, a new platform through our vendor Esri, and we are working with them on what data sets we can pull through APIs, et cetera, trying to get our hands on as much of that data, and they've been very open to that. And then obviously discussions going forward of how do we continue to expand this cooperation, et cetera. So I think it's been a good relationship and cooperative between the two parties.
Okay. Chris?
Yes, absolutely. I agree, Doug. We've met with NTIA to discuss what they're doing with respect to mapping. Amy and I were just on a panel discussion together in North Carolina, so we're collaborating with states as well. All of those discussions are very important to ultimately achieving success in this area. As to the private sector, obviously we're working with NCTA and U.S. Telecom, ITTA, WISPA, and through our open rulemaking proceeding, we're hearing from many more stakeholders. So it's a very collaborative effort across industry and government at all levels. I mentioned the North Carolina panel discussion we were recently on. We have had the benefit of working with the states of Georgia and Oklahoma most recently to see what they're doing as well. And through that process, I think that's where the ultimate success is going to come. So, thank you.
I just want to say, U.S. Telecom has appreciated the opportunity to work both with the FCC and NTIA on this. James made a comment earlier, which I agree with, which is mapping, it's the underlying data, right? There's two separate issues, data and mapping, right? So the Form 477, it's a data collection, and it has been and will continue to be a data collection. Separately, there's the element of sort of the visual display of data, which is a lot of different sources. And I think the two organizations, the FCC and NTIA, working on data collection and the actual platform to map and visualize things together is a helpful partnership.
James, do you have anything to add?
I'll go to the next question.
Okay. So we, in our research, have talked a lot about what type of information do policymakers need in order to make decisions. So I'd like to put this to each of you. What information and data do policymakers and program administrators actually need to know in order to target what we know is limited support for communities that need it most? Doug?
I think it's a little bit of everything we've talked about, right? They need to understand where it's not and where it is, what speeds, what's provided, et cetera. Because whether you're talking NTIA, FCC, USDA, right, HHS, VA, right, everybody dabbles in the broadband space a little bit, and they make investments for various programs. So that granularity is very important, but also not just where it is and isn't, but also the speeds and what's available there for expansion. So I think that I'm not sure there's anything else to be said, at least from everything we've said here today. I think that, if you get to the level of granularity, whether it's address, et cetera, whether it's shapefiles, et cetera, it provides an avenue for more efficient funding. You want to avoid overlap or duplication, however you want to word that, because that's inefficient for taxpayer. We have limited funds here to fix this problem. So I think it's very important, as much as we can, to eliminate any ability for different programs to overlap. It also allows programs to come together. If you have, you could pull several federal agencies with different programs together to serve a problem area. So it gives you various avenues to solve different problems.
Should there be information about how many people are using it?
Yeah, adoption, I think, is a critical role here. We typically, it's something that we focus on a lot at NTIA, but we typically talk about infrastructure and the need to get it out to the American public. But unless people are adopting it, and the Digital Nation report we do looks at that on a regular basis. And if you are not adopting, then we've got a different issue. And we know people are not adopting for various reasons, economically, educationally. Yeah, there's a host of ratings or lists of reasons why people don't adopt. But I absolutely do think that as we build out to rural America, we have to ensure there's an adoption process. Otherwise, the benefit will not be realized as we think it will be.
James?
So the challenges that face, again, I really think part of first of all, you're talking about a lot of data, right? We have a lot of households in this nation, a lot of databases. People have to type in data, and often their fingers don't match what their brain is telling them to do. So when you're dealing with large data sets, there are levels of complexity. I really think one of the biggest challenges is to recognize that different data is useful for different purposes. So I go back to where I started, that a map is really just a tool. So what we really need to think about when we're talking about using data or using a visual representation is, what is it that we're trying to use the map for? What is its purpose? When we think about mapping, we are primarily focused on the access question in rural America and making sure that we devote the resources as efficiently as we can. I think the idea that U.S. Telecom has put forward, which is a great, very interesting idea, and I think I'll be as interested as anyone to see the results of their pilots, highlights a different issue, not where there is not broadband, but the secondary question is, okay, if I need to get broadband to a certain location, how much money will it cost me to get it there? I mean, the fact of the matter is we've seen the success of reverse auctions in attracting interest in getting broadband to places that it isn't, but the people who are bidding have to have some idea of, well, how much is it going to cost me to get cable service or telecom platforms or wireless platforms to be able to reach particular locations. And how you answer that question in unserved America could be very different, from the mailbox on the side of the road to the house on the top of the mountain. Again, I think really the fundamental issue is recognizing what is it that we're trying to get the data to help us do, and what are the policies that we want it to support, and really trying to drilling down to making sure that we're doing our dead level best in a way that is probably least burdensome and most capable of being affected in a reasonable amount of time.
Chris, just real quick before you get started, we do want to make sure that we leave time for questions. So if both of you could just keep your responses brief.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll be very quick.
Okay.
I think many of the points of what would be useful to policymakers have been made. So I just want to touch on a couple of things. And I think James or Doug mentioned this. It is important to remember that this is a very large data set. There are approximately 3,000 filings twice a year. And I want to give a shout out to the staff at the FCC who looks at these filings and does their level best to try to make sure that they are accurate. The carriers, the providers, have an obligation, and they do certify to the accuracy of the data, and we rely on those certifications. So I did just want to mention that. The issue of subscription data has been mentioned as well. The FCC does not make public at this point in time its subscription data, but we do look at that data, obviously, and we use that data to do a crosswalk with the deployment data, again, as sort of a check on the accuracy of the deployment data. We have teed up in our notice of proposed rulemaking whether we should make the subscription data publicly available. Competitive sensitivities and those kinds of issues are at the core of why we haven't in the past, but I think it's something that should be put on the table, and we have in our open rulemaking.
I'll try to be brief. I think the short answer is the best thing we can do for policymakers is to provide the best, most accurate, granular data that we possibly can. U.S. Telecom is doing a pilot for a reason, because what we've proposed has never been done before, right? Morphing together multiple data sets, and running a process to combine that data to then identify with great accuracy and granularity each individual location, and then determining which ones do or do not have broadband. may seem, and it's a complex process, but we really do believe it can be done. That's why we're doing a pilot, because we think it can be done efficiently, effectively, quickly, and in a cost-effective manner. And we hope to prove that. And I hope that the results will come out in the next few months and you'll all agree with us that this is the right way to do it. I think the most important thing, though, is to recognize that, James talked about former FCC processes to improve the Form 477 data collection. It used to be just zip codes, then census groups, and then blocks. Each time we reform the Form 477 process, it's a rulemaking process. You can't just snap your finger and have it be done. It takes a year and a half just to go through the rulemaking process. That's just how it works in the Administrative Procedure Act world that we live in. So if we're going to do this, let's not do it half the way, right? If we're going to take a year or 18 months or however long it takes to do this process completely and actually run the new process, let's not do it halfway. Let's do it the full way. It's not a time for half measures. So we really think it's worth taking, even if it takes a couple extra months, to figure out how to really do it in a much more granular level. For all the benefits that we're talking about, we don't think we should take a half step now and then 2 years from now come back and say, you know what, we really probably should get more granular than we are today. We could have done that, but we didn't. Let's not do that. And in terms of, the one other thing that we haven't talked about I think is important is there's this notion of a challenge process. Whenever you award universal service money, especially when $20 billion are at stake, companies want to challenge the accuracy of the underlying data, right? Somebody will come in and say, I serve this entire area, right? It will be better with what we're talking about today, because we will have a fundamental understanding of where the locations really are. And if we take multiple data sources, not just relying on the carrier's self-reporting to figure out where broadband is or isn't, it will fundamentally make the likelihood of somebody over-reporting much lower. So I actually believe one of the other benefits of all this is that this lengthy challenge process that we've had in former universal service auctions, the time it takes to do that will be drastically reduced if we're starting from a much more accurate database. So there's just a lot of public policy benefits for doing this the right way and doing it now rather than down the road.
Great. I think we've got time for 2 questions. Do we have any questions in the audience?
Probably mapped out at this point.
Go ahead.
Sure.
So how long do you think it's going to take to actually process? Like, with all of the information, all the rulemaking, from each of your perspectives?
Yeah.
Proposals, how long do the proposals take, do you think, if we did have proposals that you guys present, as well as the rest of them, how long would that take? And the government?
For those watching, the question was how long it will take for NCTA's and U.S. Telecom's proposals to actually be implemented.
So I'll go first, and I'll say corrected kind of in air quotes because I do think it is an iterative process, and we're going to be trying to improve these maps, I think, for a while. But one of the reasons that NCTA at least landed on shapefiles is because we believed that the provider familiarity with shapefiles and also the government familiarity with shapefiles meant that it was the most significant improvement that we could make in the shortest amount of time. Now, how quickly that could be, that's probably a question of administrative process, but the issue is teed up in a current rulemaking, and we believe that we could essentially adopt a new process in advance of the $20 billion from the new rural, RDOF fund going out. And part of the reason for trying to make that improvement now is to the point Patrick just made, the last thing in the world that I think a cable provider wants is to submit the data we're being told to submit, which is the census block data currently. If we don't serve the entire census block, I can imagine that somebody's going to bring a challenge to say, hey, you don't serve this part of the census block over here. So, and to which we'd respond, you're right, we don't serve, but we had to submit the data we were required to submit. So part of it is trying to get us on a national basis to improve the data, to take a lot of these kind of needless challenges off the table. And we believe that, because of the familiarity we have with shapefiles, that is actually the speediest process to significant improvement.
Yeah, sure. So I agree with James. Part of this is the administrative process, regardless of how the FCC ultimately decides to reform the Form 477 process. Luckily, they've already launched the rulemaking, so we're not starting from scratch. Chairman Pai and the Wireline Bureau have pushed us off in the right direction, so we're not starting from scratch. But the commission still has to get to an order ultimately. Then there has to go through the Paperwork Reduction Act process. For those of you in regulatory land, if you know what I'm talking about, there's a process going through getting OMB approvals before you sort of do anything like this that just takes time. So part of it is just an administrative process. When we launched our pilot in April, we indicated that the results of our pilot would be done by third quarter of this year. We think I'm optimistic it will be done faster than that, completing 2 full states and being able to demonstrate the type of thing we're talking about. And our filing at the FCC suggested that to do it the way we think it should be done, it could take anywhere from 18 to 24 months. But it could also go faster. It depends a lot in terms of what administrative processes the commission has to go through and how quickly they can do it. And the reason we wanted to do the pilot was to really demonstrate that it can be done, and it can be done in a matter of months. Now, there are other steps that have to be done at the commission for it to fully be implemented and the data actually being collected in that manner. But it's anywhere from 18 to 24 months, we think, from start to finish.
Okay. Any other questions in the room?
Can I take that? So first thing I would say is the goal of the Form 477, if you go back to the original 2000 local competition report that established the Form 477, is not just to figure out where unserved locations are. It's to figure out, it was really about telephone service at the time and broadband, to figure out where telephone service is, where broadband service is, and where competition for these services are, and to be able to do all of the assessments that the commission does. And for a variety of different purposes that it relies on this information, there's a value in having a true understanding of where broadband service is at a location-specific level for a lot of different purposes. I agree with you, however, that the most beneficial purpose and where the real challenge is rural areas. There's no doubt, given the size of cable census blocks, which are much smaller than some of these larger rural areas, that the biggest challenge is going to be in these rural areas. And that, for us, when we're talking about spending billions of dollars, which, U.S. Telecom members actively participate in the Universal Service Program, so we have a clear understanding of why this is important. It's most important for those rural areas. But there's a broader benefit for having more information generally.
And I think that it's been touched on also that getting the best information possible in the hands of potential bidders in our universal service auctions has a value. We impose build-out obligations on bidders when they receive universal service support, and we want the winners to be successful. So the more information they have available to them about the precise number of locations within the area within which they will serve, the better in our view.
I mean, just to give an example there. Oh, yeah, sure.
Sorry, I just want to make sure that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Pat. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
James, go ahead.
I'm going to go ahead. I totally agree with Chris, and I think it's probably the most interesting part of this new approach that I know U.S. Telecom is working on, which is, can we get more in the unserved areas? Can we get a better fix on where the locations that need to be served are, so that we can have would-be providers can have a better idea of what it would cost to actually get service there. I think, if we could, figure that out, that would be a valuable contribution. I think to the point that you made, though, we have a large bit of work ahead of us in trying to get service to those 5 to 10 million unserved households. So we need to do it in a way that really devotes our resources there, and the places that are in fact already served, we rely on robust competition to ensure that people are going to get the best service they can, and we have other tools at our disposal. The FCC does to measure the speeds that are offered by broadband providers. So, the other thing that I think we ought to say as well is we're not the only repositories of data out there. There are lots of other sets of data that I know Doug is focused on bringing together and trying to rationalize. So, part of it is trying to see the signal through the noise and really recognize the data that's most impactful for the actual purpose that we're trying to serve.
Doug, any thoughts? You don't have to.
No, I don't think I have anything additional to add to that.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you again to all of our panelists, and thank you again for hosting us. And everybody have a nice afternoon. Bye. Thank you very much to you both. Really appreciate it. Yeah. Chris, it was so nice to meet you.
So nice to meet you
I'd
too.
love to sit
Thank
down
you.
and talk to you a little bit sometime about the research that we're doing.
Great.
Okay,
I would
we'll
love
get
that.
something scheduled.
Yes, let's do. I almost invariably leave my office without a card, but
I'm very impressed.
I believe I actually have one. It's probably so antiquated to give a card out
No, I
anymore.
got